Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. Welcome to Good Measure, and today I'm David, and I'll be your host. Today we have University of Copenhagen's very own Dr. Nielsen. Dr. Nielsen is a researcher with many papers published on addiction, psychology, youth, gaming, and game disorder. He's here today to talk with us about loot boxes and gambling. Dr. Nielsen, thank you for being here with us today. Do you mind quickly introducing yourself to those in the audience who may not be familiar with your work?
Yeah, thank you guys so much for having me. So I'm an associate professor at the IT University of Copenhagen in game psychology. My background is that I have two master's degrees, one in psychology from the University of Copenhagen and one in video games from the IT University of Copenhagen. And I combined those two interests in my PhD, where my dissertation focused on, the notion that video games cause addiction in people.
All right. And so, Dr. Nielsen, it's almost been 3.5 years since your first research paper on loot boxes. Why has mainstream media turned a blind eye to this issue for so long? Many gaming communities have actually voiced their concerns for loot boxes for ages, and it seems that only now people have begun to pay attention to loot boxes or random reward mechanics.
So I think even though games have been mainstream for a long time, I think for a lot of people it's not something that's at the forefront of what they think a lot about. So I know here in Denmark, for example, in political discussions, loot boxes and the question of whether or not kids are exposed to gambling in video games is not something that people really care a lot about. They care about taxes, they care about immigration, they care about the green transition, the environment, all that kind of stuff. So so it's not something that people really care a lot about. And I don't know, maybe it's a generational thing. Maybe we'll see that change as people who have grown up playing video games increasingly also become politicians and stuff like that.
Yeah, I agree. In the last few years, actually, there's actually been an increase in the amount of politicians and legislature that has been directed at this issue, with even your 2019 paper, Are Loot Boxes Gambling? Random Reward Mechanics in Video Games, being funded by the European Research Council. How do you think this will affect microtransactions and video games and loot boxes exactly?
So I think the big scare for a long time, of course, it used to be, do video games make my kids violent? Then the question became, and still is, do video games cause addiction, right? And I think once we've moved past the moral panic of thinking that video games are like virtual drugs, I think then we'll start to be able to have real conversations about what I think is important, the monetization strategies that different games use, right? So the free-to-play business model and loot boxes, battle passes, all that stuff. I think right now a lot of parents, they just don't know, they don't know what the difference is between a free-to-play game, a game you buy outright in what we call the box content business model, or loot boxes, battle passes, all that stuff. I think most parents, they just don't have a clue about what that means and what it entails. Like, what is grinding, and is it amoral for a game to try to keep people engaged by introducing crazy amounts of grinding or all that kind of stuff? I think that's something that a lot of people just don't have the vocabulary to be able to discuss and think about right now.
And speaking about
gamers do, of course.
Yeah. And speaking about vocabulary, nowadays with the metaverse and NFTs sort of blowing up and becoming more mainstream, how important do do you think that these NFTs and the metaverse will become in the world of loot boxes and random reward mechanics? And how do you think many companies, video game companies specifically, will try to use this new technology in their loot boxes and reward mechanics?
Yeah. So I think the one thing that game publishers have to like cling on to in saying that loot boxes are in fact not gambling is the fact that, you know, content from a game stays within the game. We see platforms such as Steam blurring these boundaries because the black market is so well established that the skins that you win in loot boxes on Steam are, you know, de facto a form of currency because it's so easily transferable. Whereas games like FIFA really do try to enforce a boundary between the real world economy and their in-game items, you know, these player cards, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think as soon as you start to introduce NFTs, and even we see now a lot of games trying to build games on a blockchain where ownership becomes, you know, something, you know, virtual items become items that you own and can transfer between people in a whole other way with a lot more security than you can right now with most skins. I think that's going to make it really obvious that these virtual objects are in fact or do function like money. And then if you then have random reward mechanics or loot boxes that dole out these rewards, then it's going to be readily apparent that that these loot boxes are in fact no different from gambling at a casino.
All right, great. And so what are the implications of loot boxes sort of disrupting the connection between payment and rewards? Like, how does this affect people going about loot boxes and random reward mechanics and their sort of psychology behind it?
Yeah. So I think for the vast majority of people, loot boxes are totally benign. But when I talk to psychologists that actually treat people in Denmark with gambling disorder, they are saying that where it used to be the case that when they got someone into the clinic with a gambling problem or a gambling addiction, they used to be young men who had started gambling on sports with their dads. Now it's more often the case that they're young men that started their gambling careers either unpacking player cards in FIFA or skin betting with skins on the Steam platform in Counter-Strike. So while we don't have any data that can kind of tell us that, you know, engaging with loot boxes as a kid will make you more likely to become addicted to gambling when you grow up. There does seem to be anecdotal evidence, at least, that that people who end up with gambling problems often start out with loot boxes on different kinds of platforms.
And so speaking about people who sort of enter this gambling disorder problem with digital items, for the audience today, what would be the most important thing for them to be sort of wary or cautious about when it comes to approaching loot boxes and sort of opening one or interacting with them in the future?
Yeah, so I think what you need to be cognizant about is that loot boxes, you know, really span the gamut from all the way from being just kind of, you know, card collecting games that we know from, like, you're based in the US, so of course your audience will know about collecting baseball cards, basketball cards, that kind of stuff, right?
Mhm.
And a lot of loot boxes function just like that. But we also have, loot boxes on the Steam platform where people actually can, invest like $1 or $2 and potentially win a skin that's worth tens of thousands of dollars. And that is straight up gambling by most definitions. So loot boxes, I think they are these benign surprise mechanics that that some game companies want to make them out to be, but they are also kind of like they are also gambling mechanics. But it varies very much from game to game. So like in a game like Horizon Zero Dawn, they have
Mhm.
these loot boxes that that have these random rewards built into them, but you can't purchase them for real world money, and what you get out of them you can sell, and so they are pretty benign, right? And I think for most parents are not going to be able to tell apart, the loot box on Steam that's straight up gambling from the loot box in Horizon Zero Dawn. That's not at all gambling.
Mhm.
So the thing you need to be aware of with loot boxes is that no loot boxes are very different. They're not the same, and some of them are straight up gambling. Some of them are not.
Okay. And so thank you very much for being here with us today. Is there anything you would like to shout out, anything you'd like to sort of plug before we end?
I wish I had something to plug. Maybe in a year's time I'll have a book out that I can plug. So I guess stay tuned for potentially a book next year.
All right, sweet. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.